Our next discussion brings NATO's commitment into focus. At a time of rising threats, how does the alliance strengthen unity and partnerships? Moderating is Minna Ålander, Associate Fellow of Chatham House. Minna, the stage is yours.
Then, please bear with us. We're very painfully aware that we're between you and the lunch that is already a little bit delayed, but I promise you this will be worth your time. So please stay and listen to us. So first, I'm happy to welcome Piers Cazalet to the stage, the Director of Defense and Security Cooperation at the Operations Divisions at NATO. After him, Karin von Hippel, Senior Advisor at Strategia Worldwide, but also known as the previous Director General of RUSI. And our third panelist, Federica Mangiameli, who is Program Manager and Policy Fellow at the Future Security Program at GLOBSEC. All right, I'm happy to kick off with you, Piers, on some happy topics. So we for sure have seen an excessive and accelerating action, actually, both within and outside of the alliance. Actually, just to bring you a little bit of news from Finland, the second newest member of NATO, and just to sort of highlight this action that is taking place. It was just in the Finnish news this morning that the new multi-core land component command has become operational, and the sauna has been used already. So very important Finnish news from the eastern flank. But if we first sort of zoom out and look outside of the alliance, the Russian war in Ukraine has obviously changed the context of NATO's partnerships quite a bit, especially with Ukraine. But NATO has also been really innovative about new cooperation formats and has been really responding to this challenge. So could you walk us through, like, what's the state of play? Let's say, for example, with the JTEC, that is a very interesting new thing that NATO has set up. And could some of these innovations in cooperation with Ukraine be also applicable to other partners?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. Thanks for the question, and congratulations on the Land Component Command. I think I'd like to start just by saying, if we cast our mind back a few years, so before even Finland was a member of NATO, partnerships were a kind of nice add-on in terms of NATO activity. So NATO had its core business, and then it was working with partners in separate fields. I think that has changed radically over the last few years, and in particular after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where allies then began to understand the importance of partnerships, the importance of building and maintaining partnerships, the importance of shared interests, shared approaches to tackling shared challenges. And this has really grown dramatically in the last couple of years. Ukraine, of course, is the focus of this in terms of how NATO as an alliance cooperates with and works with Ukraine, but this has an impact on other partners as well. With Ukraine, the relationship has changed dramatically. In political terms, we've set up new political structures and mechanisms to be able to discuss with Ukraine at the table on a very regular basis, much regular than we had before. But in terms of practical cooperation, we've really stepped up the support that we're giving to Ukraine through NATO mechanisms, but also working through other multilateral mechanisms as well. And this has been very effective. But then there's also a point where actually now as an alliance, we're beginning to understand that we have something to get back from Ukraine in terms of learning from Ukraine's terrible experience with the war. JTEC, which you mentioned, the Joint Analysis Training and Education Center, which is a joint NATO-Ukraine center, the first joint NATO-Ukraine body ever to be set up, is now operational in Poland. And it's pulling together all sorts of analysis from the war in Ukraine. And it's something that then we as allies, but Ukraine, can benefit from learning from that analysis. So that's just one example of how we're now changing the relationship in terms of not just giving support to Ukraine, but actually learning something back from Ukraine, which is a benefit to us and to Ukraine as well. But if we look at other partners as well, Moldova is another example, which has faced Russian aggression in the past. They still have part of their territory occupied by Russia. And throughout the war with Ukraine, they've also suffered drone incursions. again, working with them over the last few years, we've been able to learn from that. We're helping support them with drone incursions, but also it's given us experience that we can draw on in terms of thinking about our own defense. And we had the discussion earlier in the session today, talking about some of the drone incursions into Allied airspace. So that's been a benefit to us as well. So I think it plays across a wide range of partnerships, not just with Ukraine.
Sounds like a partnership indeed, so which is like mutual cooperation. And this is, I think, extremely welcome in the context of Ukraine, for example, that it's not only aid flowing from NATO countries to Ukraine, but that it's actually going both ways. So this is, I think, a great development. Karin, coming to you, given that you have quite extensive professional experience and background in both the US and the UK, I have to ask you, is this special relationship in this room with us, like, is it real? Does it exist? And then maybe just to like follow up on that, from your perspective, we've heard a number of times today that Europe is not really able to defend itself alone, or like generally not very capable of doing much of anything maybe. But what if it has to? And like, what will it take to make Europe more capable?
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. Thank you for the invitation to join you. And thank you, Minna, who she and I keep meeting in various countries on these panels. You know, let me just start out. I'll get to the special relationship later, but I want to follow up a bit on what Piers was saying, because I think, you know, we're all going through this very difficult period. We've been tested significantly by Russia. I think the cover of The Economist this week is Russia's testing us. In the last few days, we've seen increased activity. And I think one of the reasons they're doing this is they're trying to see, or Putin is trying to see what America will do. Now, whatever America will do, we don't know. I think we've seen that President Trump is quite unpredictable in his response. And I think Putin is also aware of that. But I do think the Europeans can do a lot more together. I think the Europeans do realize that they are in an existential moment right now. It's not just Europeans, it's the Canadians, it's the Australians, New Zealand, Korea, Japan, other like-minded allies are all in a very similar place. And I think all of these countries do really appreciate that partnerships matter, that most of these challenges we can't handle on our own. So it's not about being antagonistic to the United States, but it's, I think Momcilo said earlier, it's about coming together and working on some challenges. Now, with respect to what's been happening with Russia, you know, it's everything from cables to drones to, you know, attempted assassination, arson, etc. You know, there have been a number of responses, and I'm sure you can share more about it. I mean, not just the interesting election point you made about Moldova, but so there's obviously covert activity, but then there's, you know, support for Ukraine. There's using Russian, let's just say the interest on Russian loans. There's sanctions. There are a number of tools that we've been using, but I think we need more creative tools, and I don't think we have quite figured out what to do, because I think we need to push back in a much more significant way than we have so far. I think that's the only way to stop Russia. And the more Russia pushes in this gray area space, the more confident they will get, I think, about their military as well. And so I do think we need to stop that. And I think the Europeans, plus, let's just say the like-minded countries, are very aware that they need to do a lot more. You know, I'm not involved in any of those discussions, obviously, but it would be very interesting to hear more about what the plans are to come together. And I think I'll stop now. I want to talk about the public involvement, but maybe when you come back to me, because I would like to hear from Federica.
I do want to just like ask you a follow-up question. Like, how do you think that we should be more sort of decisive in pushing back? Like, what kind of creative methods could we? Do you have any suggestions there?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot more we can do, and certainly we could do a lot more covertly. I think we could do a symmetric response when they smack us with cyber. We do the exact same thing back. We don't have to do it publicly. I think it's not always accepted in some countries to do it that way, but I don't think we're pushing back as much as we should. And we're sort of watching this problem evolve and expand, and it's getting pretty bad right now. But I think a related piece is that throughout the European continent, you have a range of views on how important increased defense spending is, increased threat is. And you have Spain that doesn't want to spend the 3% or get up to, what is it, 2.5 to 5, 3 to 5. And then you have other countries like the Balkans, or let's just say other countries that are more aware of the Russian threat because they're closer, as we heard earlier. And then you have countries like the United Kingdom and maybe France and Germany that are, I think the governments are more seized, but I'm not sure the populations are more seized, and they're more interested in maybe, different types of program, different types of spending. And I think that we're not doing a very good job at reaching out and explaining why defense matters and why our security matters and why resilience matters. And there's positive ways to explain that. It's investments in innovation and research and education. And a lot of these investments can be used for dual use purposes. But there's also the negative side and what the ramifications are if the Russians keep doing what they're doing and we don't respond. So I think we need to get better at those two things. We need to get better at coming up with new tools beyond sanctions, etc. But we also need to get better at communicating with our populations.
Since you're suggesting more covert action, could it be that we just don't know about it?
It's possible. I just don't.
Let's hope so.
It's hard to see that there's any evidence because the Russians are doing more and more. So it kind of makes me think that they're not.
Absolutely. Federica, coming to you. So one question that is quite important for the Transatlantic Alliance is at the moment this question of sort of division of labor between the EU and NATO as well. And I was wondering because one of the topics here in this panel is this question, like whether NATO really is still equipped to sort of act as a guarantor of also democratic resilience and not only territorial integrity. I think this has been already sort of questioned on the previous panels. So would that actually be a better, would the EU be better suited for that task? And how do you view this kind of, is there some kind of good division of labor? Is it like a zero-sum game that if we do more EU, it's away from NATO and vice versa, or is there some kind of sort of plus win-win division of labor here?
Wow. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here for the first time in Budva. I think there's work to do, which I know it doesn't come as a surprise. And I also think that we cannot work in a scenario where EU and NATO do not act jointly. Because each organization has its own instrument. On one hand, you have the EU who has sanctions, rule of law mechanisms, and funding programs to protect democratic resilience, for instance, and just go so beyond the nexus of conventional defense. But on the other hand, we need NATO that brings the military structures, then military knowledge and expertise. So I don't think that the NATO and EU should work as competitors, but rather work together. And if we have a look at the history of EU and NATO relations, this probably is one of the most, can we say, controversial, but kind of complex relations. They signed the first declaration in 2016. We had the last one in 2023. The growth in terms of the expansions of competence went from 7, it was the initial areas of shared cooperation, to over 70 now. And they have done a lot of work on, for instance, hybrid threats that even way before the war in Ukraine, 2015, 2016 are the first documents where we have had last year, for instance, also joint exercises. So we see NATO and EU in certain areas are working together already and bringing what they can do best. The biggest issue in my view is that most of the times people forget that in these equations there's member states on both sides. The EU and NATO are organizations with members, and we can't. When we look at it, it's not two organizations in Brussels taking decision. It's our capitals who are doing the work or not doing the work, and these are the actual actors that most of the times represent an obstacle to the efficiency of mechanisms. So if we get into, because we hear a lot about inefficiencies on both sides, but then we have to also look at whose responsibility is that, who's not doing the actual work. So, and I want to connect because I really like the point that Karin was making on the public opinion. I'm Italian, but I've been working with GLOBSEC and I live in Slovakia, and of course, threat perception, completely different. I mean, I come from Southern Europe. My country has very different priorities than the Slovak government and the Eastern flank countries. And when I measure the awareness of the audience in Central Europe and compared to Italy, we are talking about two different worlds. So if there was the strategy that should be implemented, has to target countries like Southern European countries to raise awareness on why it is important to buy more capabilities, why it is important to spend money. And I've heard it in a previous panel about the social security. It is true that one of the biggest issues for countries in Southern Europe is why do we have to spend money to buy capabilities if educations or healthcare systems are not really good? And it's as simple as we have to. There's no other choice. And also, it is the responsibility of the capitals, of the government, to actually make sure citizens are informed. It's their responsibility to create a system where the money can also have some social and economic advantages for the countries, because investing in defense could also lead to new jobs, could lead to new economic advantages for the whole economy of the country. But this is a strategy that countries have to come up with in the defense planning, and this is just not happening.
I think that's a good point. I think that this 1.5% that was included in the Hague NATO defense spending pledge, so that the European NATO allies and Canada pledged to spend 5%, of which 3.5% is on the conventional capability or the sort of direct defense investment, and then 1.5% this creative sort of area where it can be something defense related, like infrastructure, something. I personally think that if you don't use this money actually for bridges to Sicily, that perhaps, anyways, but for example, if you invest this into dual use, as you mentioned, Karin, as well. So if you invest also in, like, let's say healthcare sector, like hospital capacity, that's relevant in peacetime and even more so in wartime. So I think this can be a way of like getting also like because resilience is not only about war, it's about many other types of crises as well. And this actually brings me back to you, Piers. Because as I mentioned, there's been a lot of action, both within and outside the alliance in the European theater. So we've seen a number of new sort of initiatives, how NATO has reacted to the new sort of sub-threshold threat environment. How can you walk us through a little bit like some of these, and like how well is NATO adapting to this? Because obviously NATO is like the Article 5 is the core piece of NATO. So how does NATO deal with this sub-threshold challenges?
Okay, thanks. I'd like as well to link that to a point that you mentioned earlier and Karin responded on in terms of the one of the remarks in one of the earlier panels about Europe not able to defend itself. And I think, at all levels, Europe is able to defend itself. And in a way that's been very much proven over the last couple of years. It's true that there are areas where Europe has weaknesses in capabilities in terms of, for example, strategic lift or intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. So there are areas where we still rely on quite a lot on US support and US capabilities. But beyond those areas, and in particular in sub-threshold threats, I think actually Europe has done really well. European NATO, European countries have done really well. It's partly the cooperation with the European Union, where again, if we're dealing with sub-threshold threats, then the links between the two organizations can make a big difference, and working together we can have joint impact. We have different sets of tools that we can bring to bear and make very, very effective. But even just looking back at some of the most recent incidents that we've had, so whether it's, for example, the severing of cables in the Baltic Sea, the recent drone appearances across Danish airports, disinformation, cyber attacks, whatever you want. There's a whole range of these activities. They've all been dramatically expanding in recent years, but we found ways to respond each time. We found ways, we built our resilience for a start, which has been a help in terms of just being able to resist some of those attacks, but then also finding ways to respond. Attribution is very important. So, being clear that we think a particular country has been responsible for a particular attack, which then calls out the nation and calls out the activities that they're doing. So we're doing that. We're defending at different levels, at that sub-threshold level, but also at the conventional threat level as well. So again, earlier there was a discussion on the drone incursions into Polish airspace, but also the Russian jet incursions into Estonian airspace. There was a robust but well-controlled, well-planned NATO response. And this is what NATO is for. This is what we've been planning for many years. The response was effective. It did what it needed to do. End of story. So I think actually we can be proud in terms of what we're able to achieve. And we've been able to see the effects of that in recent months.
I agree with you that the European response, or how it worked actually both in Poland and in the Estonian case, it went by the book, it worked as intended, and NATO is of course a defensive alliance, so the proportionality question is of course also an important question always. Karin, actually, now that we talked about sort of resilience and the European capability or ability to respond, obviously the defense industrial and technological base is one very important part of this, and that's something that Europe has been sort of lacking, or it's been at least very fragmented in Europe, and we depend a lot on American equipment. So the EU is actually here again, we're supposed to talk about NATO, but we keep coming back to EU, so I think this highlights how intertwined these two organizations are as well. So now the EU is becoming an increasingly important player, actor in the especially defense industrial field. How do you view this, maybe from a British perspective, or how do we make sure that the defense industrial base actually remains coherent and efficient and doesn't exclude European countries outside of the EU?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be one of the bigger challenges. I keep this chair. Couch is a bit too comfortable.
Yeah. I agree.
Falling asleep, but this will be the challenge going forward. I mean, we've seen with the Germans is quite interesting. Of their new spending, only 8% will go to United States defense equipment, which means that they're really focused on building up European capacity. I think the French are thinking the same. The Brits are also talking about that. They've just published their defense industrial strategy. And so I think we're getting to where we need to go, but the two challenges, the one I mentioned earlier about, even if the British defense strategy mentions we'll be at a war pace, we're going to move at war pace, I don't think the public has bought into that yet. So I think we need to work on that, and that's probably something NATO can help with. But the second piece, of course, is how the Europeans and the non-EU Europeans come together to make sure that they're not just duplicating and that they're complementing each other. And we've heard lots of different European leaders talk about this. Maybe this country can focus on this type of equipment, and this country what they're very good at. I haven't seen much leadership in that space, and maybe Piers knows more about, or Federica knows more about, what countries can provide that leadership to make sure that there's plenty of money out there. Let's just say the Europeans have plenty of money. It's just how you spend it and how smartly you spend it and how quickly you can spend it, and being quite aware about the very rapid pace of innovation that we've seen in Ukraine, that whatever you invest in, a lot of it has to go into technology and platforms that can adjust to this rapid pace of, every 2 or 3 weeks in Ukraine, we're seeing innovations and by the Russians and the Ukrainians. And so, it's very fast paced, it's moving quite quickly, and we need to be moving away from these big clunky systems that take 10, 20 years and to become more agile. So those are big challenges. I think the Europeans certainly can rise to that challenge. And NATO is incredibly helpful in that space because it can also assign countries different roles. But we do need to see some leadership and focus.
Very good. Federica, so speaking of which, the defense industrial base and all these developments, Americans often mention that they would like to see more of burden shifted in the alliance, so that the Europeans would fully take charge of our own security. This is what we hear repeatedly from the current administration. How do you view this burden shifting? How will that impact the alliance as well? Because a burden shift in that direction will mean that Europeans are maybe also more capable to operate independently, and will we still have this like US leadership in NATO, or will the leadership also be more equally divided in the alliance?
Well, I think, and I want to connect to two key words that from the speech of the U.S. ambassador we heard at the beginning of the conference, which is commitment and capabilities. But I think that is the key for the European countries within NATO. The way I see burden shifting is having European countries taking more responsibility of their security, not necessarily a complete shift in a way of United States completely disengaged from that. I don't think that's what the United States want. And the issue or the challenge remains how European countries will be able to take up this challenge. And because now we know what are the capability gaps when it comes to conventional defense. And there are so many instruments that, and here again we go to the European Union. The added value of the European Union is the capacity to mobilize funds, to create instruments that allow countries to spend money quickly and in a more efficient way. But then again, it has to be countries who actually spend money and procure weapons, right? It's not the EU or NATO doing that. So I think the key words here would be how quick we will be in being able to actually spend this money we are unlocking, and how smart and efficient it will be this expenditure. Because I'm not sure we actually need a country who's going to lead it, because in talking about leaders in Europe, it kind of, if we analyze the European bloc, it goes back to 2-3 countries always, and if we want to go at the European level, the UK as well. But I would say we all have to, unity is the added value of the European continent. So us working together and doing what we can do best in our capacity, and the ambassador also was saying the role of all members committed with their own capabilities have to contribute or can contribute to the success of the alliance. So I believe the future of NATO is definitely a stronger European pillar. I know that many people don't like this word, but I do. The European pillar within NATO with more capabilities, with modernized armed forces, with more armed forces in terms of personnel. I think that's the direction we have to go. And we have to convince our people that there's no other choice.
Will Europe play a role in the Indo-Pacific then, or is that going to be sort of
well, I think we should do one thing at times. I think we should focus on the immediate threat at the moment, but not to underestimate the influence that players like China already have on our continent, because underestimating our adversaries is usually the first mistake.
Absolutely. We have 3 minutes, so I want to see whether there's any questions. There are 2. Let's take the lady in blue.
It's hard to see.
Thank you very much. I'm here with Yada Canada, and I wanted to ask, there's been a lot of discussion about burden sharing with the US and sort of shifting more of those capabilities to Europe. And there's also been acknowledgement that the US has capabilities that Europe has not yet developed. So should the US decide, as President Trump has threatened on and off over the years, to fully step away from the NATO alliance, is there any sort of day after plan for NATO or the European Union in terms of what that would look like?
Who feels like starting? Should we go in the same?
Okay, well, maybe let me start on that very briefly. And I would say that if you look back historically to US administrations, and for example, we had President Kennedy, who was quoted here earlier, you look back at some of the stuff that he says about NATO, and European allies need to step up. So it's been a consistent message across all US administrations. The current administration, the message has been quite strong. At the same time, the US administration has also been very clear that it stands by NATO, it stands by Article 5. So I think, from that point of view, there's not a concern. There is a concern about European allies needing to step up, but European allies have accepted that. That was accepted in particular at the Hague summit. We saw that with the commitment on 3 plus 5 plus 1.5%, which is now being put into place. So these discussions continue, that work continues, and I think, for the future, we're going to get to the right place. It may take a bit of time, but we'll get to the right place with continued US commitment.
I just want to add, I think it's a good question to ask, because I think, yes, Trump has said that Article 5 matters, but he's also probably been more publicly supportive of Qatar's security more recently than he has of NATO in a systematic way. And I just don't think we can rely on President Trump in case some part of NATO is attacked. We just don't know what he's going to do, and that's why it's so important for the Europeans to really seize on this existential moment. It is existential for Europe, and I think that there is focus, but I don't think we're quite there yet. And so, it doesn't mean that NATO is going to be dead. I think NATO is still the most important security alliance, and will continue to be that way. But it has to, Canada needs to do more. A lot of other countries need to do more to keep it in the right place.
Federica, last word.
I mean, I think that simply as that, the allies will do everything possible to keep the US engaged, because at the moment there's still no alternative to that.
Well, I would say we're getting there. And on that positive note, thank you so much for... no, I don't think that anybody left early to the lunch. So thank you so much, and big applause to the panel.